the world, millions of people, like Lisa, are being pushed back into poverty because of climate change. In 2016, world hunger started to increase for the first time in a decade and has continued to increase every year since then. And that's because of climate change and conflict, with climate change exacerbating the risk of conflict, because obviously if there's water, everybody wants it, and if there's good ground, everybody wants it. The science is quite clear. The climate crisis is being caused by us, especially us in developed nations. And the answers we got from the quiz earlier would have seen the biggest things, energy production and so on. That's developed nations. The impacts are accelerating. We're running out of time to prevent the worst effects, and so we have to act fast and change the way we live. And governments have to be much more ambitious. In the Bible, Jesus tells us the most important commandments are to love God and to love our neighbours. Tackling the climate crisis is vital to both of these. Honouring God by protecting his creation and loving our global neighbours who are hit first and worst by what is now a climate emergency. Our world is broken, but God is at work reconciling and restoring. We saw that earlier in the animation about the brokenness of the world and God's mission to bring restoration and reconciliation. Another Paul's letters, Colossians, he says, "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him," that's Jesus, "and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross, to reconcile to himself all things, things on earth and things in heaven." I think this says we need a much bigger view of Jesus. He didn't just come to reconcile me with my Father in heaven, but to reconcile and restore all things in heaven and on earth. And Harry quoted that last week, if I remember right. So that's far more than just us. Harry was talking in relation to the church, but even then he was saying it was more than the church. Jesus came to begin the restoration of the world, to how God intended it to be, to make all things new. Jesus values creation, shows us how it reveals the love of the Father, and brings restoration and healing, uniting everything back with God. We can have hope. We sometimes think it's all a hopeless situation. Because of Jesus' death on that cross, all things can be made new. Everything sin has broken and corrupted is being restored and reconciled to God. It is an ongoing process, but it seems hard to see it. And we can be part of that. Jesus invites us to participate in his mission to the world. The world is crying out, but God is at work and invites us to join him in the ministry of reconciliation. Reconciling people to their Father, reconciling people to each other, and reconciling people to the creation we've been given to care for and to see it restored. It's the fullness of the gospel. It's not a side issue, it's all part of it. Because God doesn't have bits and pieces to his gospel. God's gospel is a whole for the world. So what can we do? Or just a slight deviation to a story in the Old Testament about Esther. She was faced with a crisis, and she responded with faith and courage. The Persian king had made plans to wipe out the Jews, but Esther's uncle warns her of the plan. Esther's response of the news of the threat to her people is quite remarkable. She tells her uncle to gather the people together to pray and fast. While they do that, she will approach the king and ask him to reconsider his decision, even though she knew that was against the law and that it could well lead to her loss of life. So she says to her uncle, "Go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. She teaches us that following Jesus requires us to speak up against injustice, even when it's costly to ourselves, and that we should act from a foundation of prayer. So, we should all be joining in prayer and action to address this huge injustice of climate change and its impact on the poorest people. Many promises were made at the COP summits, and some progress was made, but we've already seen that those promises are slipping, and the talks themselves fell short of delivering justice and a safer future for millions of people. So we need to continue to pray. We need to continue to take our own action, and to, when we get the opportunity, to put pressure on those people who can make the big decisions. The government, our governments especially. They made these promises, they should be keeping them. And maybe there's stronger things we need to do. When we speak up and pray together, we can make a real difference. Just like Esther did. And also when we do that, we can stand alongside people like Obitha and pray for climate justice to be delivered to those the most vulnerable, that they may have restoration of their lands. For these poor people are the most vulnerable. Can you imagine living in a place, it hasn't rained for 6 months, and it's not rained for 2.5 weeks here, and it seems like a long time. Our land is not dry like that. We've got the green things growing. We've got food. But people like her are most vulnerable. They live in poverty and are likely to die prematurely in poverty if things carry on. So stand by these people in our prayers and in our actions. I did think of having a time for you to give some feedback, but